This meeting is being recorded.
Well, that's nice to know. Hello, and welcome to the Utah Poetry Festival. I'm Paisley Rectal, your state poet laureate, and this evening's host, or this afternoon's host, I should say. I'm delighted to start wrapping up this weekend's core festival events with today's craft session. And it's about multimodal poetry, which should be really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place virtually on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and that Utah is home to 8 distinct tribal nations. Before handing over this panel to the moderator, Lisa Bickmore, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and the Utah Humanities Council for making these events possible. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you out there in Zoom land for coming and supporting poetry. If you are interested in today's event, you might be interested in the last craft talk taking place today, which is on organizing a poetry manuscript. We know you have a book in that drawer, okay? This is a way to fix it up and get it sent out. Or our final headline reading tonight at 7 p.m., which is going to be taking place also virtually. John Belk, Danielle Dubrasky, and Nancy Takacs, all poets from Southern Utah, will be reading from their just published collections. You can register for that at our website, www.utahpoetryfestival.com, which is a site that I'll also put in the chat. I'll also put the schedule link in the chat for all of you to see the other talks today and events that are going on statewide the rest of this month. This Utah Festival is actually statewide month long. So there are lots of other in-person events probably close to where you are, and all registration and location information for all of these events can be found via that link. Today's speakers have books out, and we have a wonderful virtual book fair going on. So I'll be putting the link to our book fair into the chat throughout this session to remind you of your duty to support our wonderful Utah poets by purchasing their books. Today's session is a largely informal conversation between the panelists. Just a reminder to ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. To sing our panelists' praises, please use the chat feature. Your moderator, Lisa, will be handling the questions and reading them to the panelists as needed. So that's the housekeeping for this afternoon, and I will step out and be delighted to hear what takes place.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thank you, Paisley, for, we said this before, but I want to say it again, for all your hard work and putting together the Utah Poetry Festival. It remains one of my favorite events of the poetry year. I always feel rewarded by everything I listen to and the participation that I get to have. And so I am also super excited to be talking with the 4 panelists here, all of whom have super interesting, I just used super twice, very interesting perspectives and practices with regard to multimodality and working in multiple mediums. I'm going to just read a brief introduction for each of them of their bio that I snagged from the internet, and then I'm going to start by asking some questions. As Paisley said, we welcome your questions, so if you have them, please put them in the Q&A. Okay, so let me start with Alex Caldiero, who is a teacher, a polyartist, sonopsopher, and scholar of humanities and intermedia. And he says of himself that he makes things that at times appear as language or pictures or music, and then again as the shape of your own mind. He has, and I'm not sure if he still is, but taught at Utah Valley University as a resident artist. Ben Gunsberg lives and teaches in Logan at Utah State University. He has an MFA from the University of Alabama, a PhD from the University of Michigan. He's the author of one poetry collection, Welcome Dangerous Life from Turning Point, and one poetry chapbook, Rhapsodies with Portraits from Finishing Line. Laura Stott is also the author of 2 collections of poetry, Blue Nude Migration, most recently from Blue Links House Press, and In the Museum of Coming and Going from New Issues Poetry and Prose. She teaches at Weber. And Danielle Susi is a woman of all trades. She is a writer, artist, and producer. She is the author of the poetry chapbook, The Month in Which We Are All Born, Dancing Girl Press. And she also does more arts and stuff than you can even imagine. She's a fiber artist, a performance artist, improvisational artist, and one of the best thinkers I know. And so I would say that that also applies to all of our panelists. So I'm going to start with a very simple question. What are the mediums and modes that you personally use in your own work? And what is your process? Could we start with Danielle?
Sure. Hello. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Lisa. I'm very grateful to be in community with these wonderful people. I think what is really interesting about this question for my own work is that I see these multimodalities as like parts of me as the creator of my work, rather than the way that they intersect in like intentionally. And so I primarily am a poet, but I'm also a fiber artist, like you said. I'm a social science researcher. I'm a PhD student, which consumes most of my time. For those, I mean, you all know this, right? And so what I'll say is that I think so much of what has informed these different parts of the things that I make are my experience as as a museum and gallery curator too, like seeing the way that things intersect with one another. And I think the way that my brain works is just finding these kind of natural connections. And it's also no surprise to me that many poets I know are also fiber artists. At first I was like, wow, what a strange coincidence. And I was like, no, Danielle, it makes perfect sense if you think about the way that we think about tactility, and we think about how words are sort of like woven together, and the way that we find words, the way that we create a kind of methodology if we're going to think about research. And I think when I think of all the ways that the things that I do intersect, it's like they are an inquiry. They're a kind of inquiry and a kind of investigation. And so it is, you know, social science research. It is a curatorial practice. It is a fiber practice, and it's writing, right? And yeah, those are kind of the things that I have done and do. And I think you'll find that other people in this wonderful conversation have a little bit more intersection between like the written word and some other multimodalities. But I think of myself as being like a singular being who is able to do these things, and they interact in the brain and in the mind. And ultimately they do kind of interact when I'm thinking about like the work that I make too. Yeah.
Thank you. Alex, I started with the question of what are the mediums or modes that you use in your own work, and what's your process? Could you be our next guide? Hey, Alex, you're still muted.
How's now? Okay. If I could take a liberty to answer that question, I'd like to go directly. I thought there was that I'd have a 4-minute, 3-minute kind of intro to things before addressing anything in particular. So if I could, I'd like to hold this up, and if you could get a sizing it. And my answer to that question is Oma I le fle ouf fle 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 flavlouf fle 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 oh my fle 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 fle. Flowers are amazing. And when I think about medium, I think primarily of one medium only, my body. And every other medium becomes extensions of it, whether it be the visual, the sonal, the movement, gestural, and my process is to surprise myself and to surprise others. How do I do that? And it's kind of a self-defeating situation, because by the very fact that you want to surprise yourself, you can't surprise yourself if you think you're going to surprise yourself. So I have to catch myself at odd moments, which can happen at any time. I think you're muted now. Oh,
I
there you
am.
go. All right. Well,
Ben, would you like to take the question now?
Okay, let me unmute here. Hi. Yeah, thanks. Let me, I think I can share my screen, and I'm gonna just have a little bit of an intro, because I think like other people on the panel, it feels like I'm always exploring with different modalities. I think primarily I work with sound, in addition to like alphanumeric text, and I'm really interested in the interplay between the two and the kind of questions that arise when something is written and then when it's spoken or read aloud. If the speaking is different than the written text, is there music involved, rhythm, melody, harmony, what kinds of effects are happening? But I think more broadly to this topic of multimodality, I think the thing that brought me to it is curiosity. And I just want to I have a little presentation that will sort of give you a sense of the kinds of questions I like to ask. So I'll just share my screen here. And hopefully everyone will be able to see this. And I'm going to be joined, a friend of mine is going to help me narrate this. Let me know if you can't hear it. Okay, so those are some of the questions. I think the thing that I was trying to get at with my little friend was, I don't know if you noticed how your attention was drawn to or distracted by the sounds. And so this idea of the economics of attention, I think, is really interesting when it comes into working with different modes. I was deliberately playing with images and little just different transitions in the PowerPoint, and thinking about line breaks in terms of these slide breaks. And what I talk about with my students is you need to keep in mind how much sort of bandwidth the audience has, and how much do you want to be dispersing their attention, and how much do you want to be focusing your attention. And it just adds another layer of complexity to the types of decisions I'm making when I'm, say, working with like sound and written text. It could be very distracting, which could take away from the piece, or maybe like fragmentation, juxtaposition, dissonance is like part of the subject of the poem, if it's a poem. And so sometimes that can be really useful. So anyway, those are sort of the things that I'm thinking about right now as I try to blend some of these different media and modes of representation.
Thank you, Ben. That was really such a generative set of questions and a performance, video performance. Thank you. Okay, Laura, what do you have to say?
Okay, hi. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and that was so fun. Ben, it took me a minute to realize there was this other little face making anyway, making those sounds, and it was so delightful when I realized it. That was a really fun experience. So I guess to kind of go way back, I want to talk a little bit about when I was growing up. My mom is a visual artist. There was a lot of art in the home, and she had a kiln. So there was a lot of making things, and I did creative dance. And so, my whole childhood, I was basically taught to dance stories, that like, I was thinking about that when Alex was talking about the body and poetry. And so I think I've always been really interested in just intersecting the arts and seeing what happens when they're working together. So I've done different kinds of things. My husband's a musician, and we've tried, putting the music and the poetry together. And my second book, there are paintings in there that my sister did, and they're behind me here on the wall. And it is, I did some videos just trying to kind of intersect some of the poems and those images together. So I played around with video as well, but probably my favorite medium to work with as far as this is concerned, and sort of like my upcoming summer project, is working with clay. And so I'm going to share my screen and just kind of show you what I mean. And maybe I'll preface this and kind of let you know that so this started 19 years ago when I was in graduate school, and I was in a literary editing class, and the assignment was to create a journal. And so I was simultaneously taking a ceramics class for fun, which I don't know, maybe that was a little crazy to take the ceramics class for fun when you're working on your MFA, but I used it. And so I created these journals out of clay, and I got poems for my friends and put them in there, and they were pretty big sculptures. And my professor was not expecting that. It was Christopher Howell, but it was really fun to kind of to work on. And so all these years later, I'm still kind of playing around with this idea. And so what I really like about it is this notion of encountering the sculptural form in order to get to the poem itself. So I just have a few pictures I can kind of show you. This is probably the last attempt I made at this. So this is kind of what they look like. And in this set, you actually can't read the words, but I would like to, it was an experiment. Let's see what happens. They were high fired, and I knew that the glaze was going to run, but I wanted to kind of see what effect it would have. And I like it as an art form, and just looking at those, I think they're really interesting. I've had these sitting out in my yard and some rainwater collected inside, but I kind of like the way it looks. So, and anyway, so that kind of gives you an idea. And so there are these little clay sculptural forms. but I think I'm just really fascinated with just that idea of having to encounter another form of art to get to the poem itself. So hopefully upcoming summer project, I want to make some where you can read the poems, even though I still feel like these are pretty interesting. The idea for size, they are about, I will show you because I have one sitting with me. They're about this big. So the ones that I am going to work on coming forward are just going to be no glaze on the outside. So they'll have a much different look. But as far as process goes, I think in the past, I've kind of worked with having the poem and then having the art form over here and then saying, okay, how can I get these to work together and intersect? But with this particular project, I've been thinking about like actually writing the poems for this piece itself. And so I've been thinking a lot about conceptualizing that and like what kind of themes I want to have involved. Somebody mentioned to me, my sister-in-law was like, why don't you try pit firing? And I was like, what in the world is pit firing? And so, and just thinking about like an actual bonfire being on top of the poems and like, how does that intersect like the process of creation with the words themselves? So those are, I've been thinking about that as far as process goes, and it's been a little bit interesting to be working from it from a different angle. So those are, I hope that answers the question.
It's awesome. Yeah. You must have maybe at some point seen one of the earliest instances of human writing in the Mesopotamian clay tablet, right? You know,
Yeah.
like just mark making in the soft clay as a way of beginning to communicate in a written form. I'm going to pick up on some threads of some things that you said because I had a little list of questions, but they were pretty utilitarian, and I feel like everything you all have said is much more interesting. So I wanted to think about what Alex said about the sort of everything comes from the primary instrument, which is the body. And Kim said she thought, Kim Johnson in the chat says, the medium of my body seems like a useful way to think about poetry's site of operation. And I'm thinking also about what Ben said about the sort of the ways that our brain activity and the way that that's instantiated in our attention. And the brain, of course, is a part of the body, right? Those things change shape as they interact with different kinds of sensory input. So I guess let me ask Alex, how do you think about the human being receiving your performance in the medium of your body? How does that, are you seeking to, I guess the other thing I wanted to bring up is Ben's point about the way that one's attention can be overwhelmed. And maybe this is a question I want to ask Alex, is do you seek to overwhelm your listener / reader? How do you think about that? The attention of the reader with your performances in that complex medium of the body?
Well, I like the word attention because it is about creating a tension, between the performer and the audience, to the point where, what came to my mind as you were asking this and setting that up was a string, the Pythagorean idea that you stretch it and there's a tension, and that's how you get the sound out, and the sound is very dependent on that, how much tension you put. So during a performance, for me, there's the play, and it's not necessarily, it's very intuitive, but it's a play of how far apart, how close do I get, how far apart, and at every moment, sensing all of that as a whole experience within the room, So for instance, right now, the things that, well, yeah, maybe I leave it at that.
I like what you're saying there, Alex, about the sort of the proximity, or the degree of proximity that you have with the listener, hearer, reader. Let me ask you, Ben. In your PowerPoint, so interesting that you were productively seeking to overwhelm, it seems to me, the viewer and listener at certain points.
Yeah, I was bringing, I mean, you probably saw this, what's it called, Isaac? This thing? Automaton. This is my son's instrument, the automaton. And I was actually going to do something with like my guitar or a flute or something, things that I actually play. But then he started playing this. I was like, this is so annoying. This sound is so sort of odd. And if I put it next to the camera, that would be distracting. And I was just curious. It was a little bit of an experiment. Like, could people read it and hear the sound? Was it disruptive? Because I feel like some multimodal work, multimedia work is kind of overwhelming, and it doesn't allow for enough focus. So that's just a question that I always have when I'm doing this kind of work is, how much is too much, and is it productive? Because one of the tensions that I think Alex, I love the idea of the string. One of the things that he brings up, one of the tensions is always between the modes, right? There's always tension, and you can have more or less of that. You can have more consonance or dissonance. In like, the sound wave almost is going to be different depending on whether or not they're contrastive or they're sort of working together. And so I'm constantly sort of probing that idea when I'm working with, say, sound and text, alphanumeric text on the page, which I love. I love reading. I love the focus I can have when I read. And so I'm almost wary sometimes to add things to it, because I'm worried it'll somehow distract from or take away from the reading experience. But sometimes it can add to it and enhance it.
Or make it another kind of experience altogether.
Yes, totally. Altogether, right.
To reading or down the street from reading. Laura, what about the fact that, as you've been playing with these clay structures, you're thinking about sort of adding text to them? I'm very interested in that. It's like the textuality of your clay structures is sort of hermetic at this point, and you're trying to make it more explicit.
Yeah, I guess I just thought I would like to, I'm not a ceramicist. Like I don't know that much about it. I've taken like introduction to ceramics probably 4 times. And I haven't, gone above that. But one day I've got small children, so I think as soon as they're in school, I'll probably like sign up for some classes and get more knowledge of how it works. But I think part of it is just learning the medium and wanting to maybe get it so you can read those words and see which I prefer. The idea I have, and it's because they're going through a kiln and they're being fired, and there's ways to do it. You can use slip to write onto clay. But I'm thinking, okay, if these are going to be in a bonfire, they're going to like be charred and black, but I've got to have the words visible. And so if they're the only thing glazed, that might be interesting, and maybe they'll still be illegible. I don't know, but ask me in 6 months. We'll see how they look. Yeah, so I guess maybe the process of just figuring it out, and I think that's part of it, is when something comes out of a kiln, it never looks, at least in my experience, it never looks the way I think it's going to look. And so it's part of the surprise, is there's this element of not having any control, which I kind of like.
Those of you who know me, and not all of you know me that well, but have heard me talk about extol the virtues of amateurism. So I just really love the idea that exploring new mediums is a way of discovering what they can do. And that to me is like, that's a pedagogical point too. Like a lot of people are anxious about trying a thing that they haven't tried before, because, there's professional levels of being able to, say, be a videographer, or to produce a whole video movie, or to produce ceramics or textiles or anything really. So I love the idea that exploration is itself the way of figuring out what the connection and the dissonances and so forth are between the modes. Danielle, I see you hiding in the corner. Actually, I kind of don't, but tell me
I'm
what
not
you
in the
think
corner
about
on
this.
my screen if that's, we're all in weird places.
Tell us what you're thinking about this sort of idea of dissonance or of sensorily overwhelming, in some sense, the reader or the person who's experiencing the work.
Yeah. I teach at Salt Lake Community College, and I teach humanities, and we were doing an activity the other day, and I had them pair up, and we were defining, like, spirituality, happiness, well-being. We're in that module. It's the end of the semester. We're trying to hit it home with, we just covered genocide for 6 weeks. So we're trying to get excited about a life again, So we're talking about things that are a little bit more metaphysical and exciting. And I had them pair up, and they each offered like a 1 to 2 sentence definition of spirituality. And I had a student turn to me and say, "Here you are without your physical body." And I could have walked out of the room. I was like, "Who are you? You've been so quiet this whole semester." I have been thinking about that the entire week. Because I think about, like, if I'm not here, right? Like, the things that I have made are the things that remain of my spirit, of my being. And I am not, I'm not interested in the overwhelm. I think there is so much merit in the overwhelm and so much excitement in the overwhelm. I have enough overwhelm in my life, and my therapist tells me I need rest. So I am working toward that. I think the process of when I make things sort of stems out of like this long matrilineal sort of heritage that I have in fiber work. My mother and her grandmother and my dad's grandmother, like every matriarch in my family either like knit or crocheted or made lace or whatever. And from a very early age, I knew how to sew, and knew how to sew before I knew how to do a lot of things. And I went to a very experimental art school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, for my MFA. And it was very encouraged to, in your writing practice, also be taking graduate courses in fine arts practices. And so I was taking a lot of courses in fiber and material studies and in curatorial studies. And those greatly informed one another. I think about, like the cento form and the way that we have to like collect cento. There's so much conversation around how to say the word. I'm Italian. I'm going to tell you it's cento. And so even the collecting of other lines of other people to make something new, like I think about that from a curatorial perspective too. Or when you're putting together a manuscript, like part of that is also hyper curatorial. I mean, it's almost nearly curatorial, right? Like you have to think about the way that the book creates itself and how you kind of play a role in that. But yeah, the fiber studies in particular, I think have been incredibly informative to my writing. And I found that a lot of the visual work that I was making was really focused on incorporating natural elements like moss and wood and bark. And so my writing also tends to do that, and also tends to incorporate lots of sort of natural elements. And so, yeah, I've been really thinking about how those two maybe subconsciously interact in my brain as they make them too.
I like the way that those two modes of doing artistic work, the curatorial and the textile, become both practices in and of themselves, but also metaphors then for writing and ways of thinking about writing.
Lisa, can I jump in for a sec about because I was thinking about the textiles and versus like a video or music, right? Is that certain forms work with time differently. and give the viewer, consumer, listener, a totally different experience. So I think thinking about how time works in relation to attention, and then where does the agency lie in the experience of the viewer, reader, consumer, whatever, is a really important thing if you're doing this kind of work.
Yeah, and Ben, I'll add to that too and say, yes, it's time and consumption, but it's also time and creation, right? Like
Totally.
Textile is just a very slow process. Of course, there's like machinery and whatever, but if you're doing something by hand, like I have worked on projects for years, right? And so I've also worked on my book for like 10 years. And so you can, there's a really easy, everyone's like, yep, we've all been there. But yeah, there's like a really easy connection there to make, to say that maybe one of the reasons I love weaving or embroidery is because it takes, it's the hand and it's the brain, and it is slow, and it has to be slow. There's no other option but to be slow.
Totally. And you see it when you look at those textiles that, you can see the time in the craft itself. And I'm comparing that to, say, like an improvisational solo in music, right? Which is literally happening and being created before your eyes, which is like it's a different kind of appreciation in a way. And so, it's almost the opposite end, where something is being performed on the spot and in a sense made up, versus this long time that you talk about with weaving. Really interesting.
I would just add that time presents itself differently in different modes. Like I know I've told people this, that I had a sabbatical a few years ago where I taught myself to make video essays. And I mean, really literally from scratch, and asking questions as I went along. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the way that the body seems to disappear in digital creation, because it doesn't, and so bodily time also, right? The body experiencing the time of creation. So like it feels, when you look at a textile piece, I think you imagine the time that it took to create it differently than you do imagine the time of a digital creation, perhaps. And to use your example, Ben, of the improvisational solo, which is built, of course, upon years and years of practice, right? Anyway, I'm going to ask you, I have two questions I want to ask you, and I hope we have time for them. Maybe you can choose which one you want to answer, or answer them both. I'm interested to know who you think is doing interesting work. And it doesn't have to be a new person. I mean, because obviously you all are doing interesting work, but giving our audience maybe some more ways into this topic. And then, now I've forgotten my other question. Well, for heaven's sake, who's doing interesting work?
I'll answer that. One of my favorite poets who's doing a lot of multimodal poetry is Nance Van Winkle. I can put her name in the chat, but she has a wide range of really interesting things that she's doing. Like, I was in a workshop with her years ago where she had us, putting poems on little honey locust pods that come off the trees, but she has these really fabulous, like what she calls photomes, with these photographs and kind of doing the photoshopping and getting the words in there. And she works often with old encyclopedias and just taking pages out of old books and then kind of repurposing them, and really some beautiful, interesting poems there. So I'll put her name in the chat. She's definitely someone to look up.
I remembered my other question. I just needed you to talk, Laura. The other question is, where would you suggest people start if they want to try to make something multimodal?
I can add to folks who I think are doing interesting things. Amaranth Borsik was like my first introduction to multimodal poetry in like 2010, when I didn't know what a QR code was. And she was like, girl, let me show you QR codes and how friggin' cool they are. And she's, I think, just really incredible and really sweet. I think Toby Altman is somebody I knew way back in the day in Chicago and is doing really incredible things with like the conversation around architecture and poetry. And then my very sweet friend Diana Koinoyan, who I think is like such a master of the work that she does. And I had an opportunity to kind of curate a show based around some of the work that she was doing, like some of the visual work that she was doing. So I think those are three people that I really love. In terms of how to get started, great question. I think you just have to try a whole bunch of things, right? I think you have to really, and this is like kind of the like an annoying thing, right? You just have to expose yourself to so many things. And maybe you try ceramics, or maybe you play with your son's automaton, right? And you're figuring out, like, does this work? It's a lot of experimenting, which I think is rather fun though. Like the experimentation is part of that process too.
When I was in college, I was tired of my roommates eating my food, so I started writing poems on it. Like I'd write like some haikus on my bananas or something, and it worked. They were like, "Oh, this is art. I'm not supposed to eat it." But sometimes just doing something really simple where you apply the poem to something else and just see what you think when that happens. So.
I have a very primitive mind. So who's doing anything interesting, I still find looking at an internet and a virtual or digital, anything of that nature, just astounds me and amazes me to this day. What we're doing right now, for me, is just amazing. And it's a work that is collaborative. And yet I remember when I first encountered a word processor, starting to work as a technical writer, 1984. Remember 1984, holy cow. And I was just completely blown away by what this thing is. And so I don't think in terms of people as much as I think in terms of the mediums that we're exploring, and especially the medium that we explore when we all walk away from all these instrumentalities and are left with our own bodies, just to return to that, which I think is just amazing. It's just amazing. And everything we do, everything we make, is just astounds me, and that's why I also, just to echo a little bit what Lisa was saying about the beginner's mind, the amateurish, the things seen for the first time. Those are the things that really are happening. And as far as how to access all of that, for me, has always been to include the senses, as many as you can in whatever you're doing. Very simple, very difficult, to just include the senses. If you're doing something visual, include the other senses. And it's kind of a little game, and it's kind of, children do this all the time. They kind of cross-pollinate, from sense to sense. And that's what I think, feel. That's one word.
I'll just echo what Lisa said. That's what Alex is saying is so cool. And just spirit of experimentation, a sense of play and playfulness, and a willingness to fall on your face, and patience, especially if you're working with technology, because there's always going to be some kind of learning curve. A couple people that come to mind. The person that sort of introduced me to this kind of work is Thylius Moss. He was teaching at Michigan when I was there, was doing early work in digital video and animation of text. And let's see who else. I would say, yeah, Nance, very much Nance Van Winkle. And Robin Bain also does work with, she's a flautist, and so she'll perform, and she's written work, and then she'll play her flute. That's really fun to check out online. And then also someone working in visual media would be Sarah J. Sloat, a very interesting artist, does a lot with collage and like blackout poetry. Really interesting to check out. So
we're at 2:45, and I don't know how many of you were at the book art or the artist book session this morning, which was super interesting. But one of the things that Craig Dworkin talked about, which I was really struck by, was the idea that the act of reading is always in the moment of reading. And I'm thinking about our experiences of multimodal works, which are multisensory. I loved what Alex said about, cross-pollinating the senses. I think that's so beautiful. Anyway, I think about encountering multimodal works is one of those things, just like reading poems, that requires time, attention, and maybe multiple acts of attention, and in some ways creating with that spirit in mind, in the ways that we do when we create our poems, that reward multiple attentions, is a beautiful thing. Anyway, I was not asked really to make a final statement, but I did want to, so I did. Any last words from the panelists or last questions? I just want to say how much I enjoyed talking to talking to all of you and hearing what you had to say. And I just want to encourage everyone who's here in this session to explore the work of these wonderful writers, all of whom shared so much today. Thank you. And thank you, Paisley.
Thank you. This was a wonderful panel. And I will say, if you are actually following me on Twitter, which is the most disgusting thing ever to say, or on Facebook, we are actually showcasing the work of Utah poets via video that they've sent in some short poems. And it's a great way to find out what Laura and Ben have created. And also Lisa, she also created this beautiful poem, Dear David. So Ben and Laura are coming up. I think we still haven't gotten to your poems yet. But definitely take a look and you'll see some of the stuff that they're doing, and it's fantastic. Thank you all for your time, your attention. Alex has disappeared again. It's sort of like, where's Waldo with Alex? But he's there. Okay, hi, Alex. I want to thank you all again for your time. Thank you all out there in Zoom land. There are 2 more things coming up. Organizing a poetry manuscript is coming up at the top of the hour at 3. And then, of course, tonight's final headline reading, but that does not mean that we are done celebrating poetry, because it's April and it's here to kill us all, evidently. So tomorrow night, Queer Poetry Night is happening at Under the Umbrella here in Salt Lake City. That's live in person at 7 p.m. And there are all sorts of poetry slam events going on at the end of the month, plus many events happening around David Lee's readings in Southern Utah. So please take a look at the Utah Poetry Festival website. All that information is up there. All of the registration and location information is there too. Thank you again. Have a weekend. Hope to see you in the next 15 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you.